Good afternoon. We're going to be discussing Parshat Tzav, which is this Parshat HaShavua. A couple of little PSAs, I guess. First of all, next week, there's not a weekly Parsha because it instead is one of the intermediate days of Pesach. Immediately after Pesach, as in it ends Thursday night, that Shabbat is Shmini, because if you haven't had enough to deal with in terms of food and what have you, it's reminding us about kashrut standards. That Parsha discussion will be recorded at some random time because that Thursday is still Yom Tov. So just understand and work with me. It's going to be a little crazy right now, and we're just going to need a bit of flexibility. So, Parshat Tzav, for whom are the Karbanot intended? We're going to talk a lot about hachana, about preparation, which also is obviously timely, shall we say, in terms of Pesach and all the hachana we're doing before we get to the Sadarim. But at any rate, hey, that's the way the Parshiot roll, and we know that, and we just work with it. So preparation of the sacrifices, of the Karbanot, following strict instructions with specific details, definitely can put us on overload. Or perhaps we're right in the zone because of our own Pesach observance, everything that it takes to observe Sukkot, Shabbat preparations, and so forth. As I have often stated, this is about community, and when we join together to become community. It requires efforts, thought, intentional planning, and consideration of all who will be at our table, in our shul community, in our lives. The reason the preparations, the hachana, are so important is to guarantee to the best of our ability that the experience itself will be meaningful, proper, and instill the intended reactions connecting us to each other and to God, according to our Jewish teachings and instructions specifically. This should be kept in mind as we consider this parsha and the ones before it and after it, so absorbed with hachana, preparation for the actual event, if you will, so that we have just the right experiences in the cultural context of the Torah for our korbanot, for those offerings that make us closer to God. Translated in the vernacular as sacrifices, but as we've said, I'm not so thrilled with that word and what it evokes in terms of giving up versus korbanot, just to make us come closer. Note that the focus is on the meaning of the details for us, more than the details themselves per se. To set this tone, let us ponder what Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks, Zechrono L'Shalom, teaches that we must remember, and consider that the Torah is not humanity's book about God, but God's book about humanity. Had the Torah been our book about God, the focus would have been on the divine miracle. Instead, it is about the human response to what God does. In other words, our texts of Vayikra are all about our response to God's expectations, hopes, and aspirations for us. And maybe that is a message that would further explain in terms of the previous discussion about why Vayikra was for so many, many, many years and generations the book that we actually began our young children's education with. Our Parsha is replete with details about these offerings that bring us closer to God and join us together in community. The importance of proper hachana, preparation, and kavanah, intentionality, are repeatedly emphasized throughout these instructions. For example, let's look at the text of the fourth aliyah of our parsha. Vayidaber Hashem el Moshe lemor, and God spoke to Moshe, saying, Take Aharon, take his sons, and the garments, and the anointing oil, and the sin offering bull, the 2 rams, the basket of unleavened bread, everything that you need to take, the shopping list, if you will. Ve'et kol ha'edah hakahal, el apetech ohel moed, and assemble the entire community at the entrance of the tent of meeting. V'yas Moshe kasher tziva Hashem oto. And Moshe did exactly what God commanded him to do. V'tekahel ha'edah apetech ohel moed, and the community gathered at the tent of meeting. And Moshe says to the community, Zeh hadavar asher tziva Hashem lasot. This is what God has commanded us to do. Moshe then brings Aharon and his sons forward, bathes them in water, places the tunic upon him and the clothing upon them, as we've discussed earlier, put all of the garment elements on Aharon, places the choshen on him, and then inserts into the choshen the Urim Utumim. Remember all of the symbolism and meaning invested in these items, and how the symbolic meanings that they evoke are precisely what give them meaning. The choshen, if you can imagine, was a beautiful piece of jewelry, but that was not the purpose of the choshen, and all of the stones meant something significant. He then places the cap on Aharon's head and places on the cap towards his face the golden chivlet, the holy crown that sits as God has commanded. Moshe then takes the anointing oil, anoints the sanctuary, everything in it, and sanctifies them. He then goes on and he sprinkles from the altar 7 times, anoints the altars, and so on. And then Moshe brings Aharon's sons forward, clothes them with their tunics, with their sashes, and does everything. And what's the theme that goes through this? Ka'asher tziva Hashem et Moshe. God commanded Moshe to do all of this. Interestingly enough, this is sort of the answer to where is Moshe's name in Parshat Tzav, which came earlier, which we spoke about, where Moshe is performing the investiture of office. His name is not mentioned. He is found in the Ve'atah every time, and God says, and you shall do this. But here, in this repetition, Moshe's name is oft repeated. Remember that all of this is done within the gathering of the people, so that all are part of the entire ceremony and all experience it fully. Moshe, Aharon, the Kohanim, the people, and the various elements of the rites to be observed are all brought together in a symbiotic manner. The focus is on the totality, and though the details may seem daunting and overwhelming, they are clarified as being needed for this greater purpose. We must remember this through this Parsha, all about the Karbanot and their many elements. And again, to make it relevant to us, for those of us that are in the middle of Pesach preps, and I see who's watching, and yes, we are all doing this, we're doing what we're doing to prepare for the experience. And the preparation, ideally, is to be as meaningful as the experience and finds meaning in the experience. When you look around your Seder table and everybody's sitting there and you have good food and it's so beautiful and everything is so lovely, you take pride in all that you did to put that together. So it is with the Karbanot and this explanation. Consider for a moment when Rabbi Sachs calls our attention to our Haftarah for Parshat Tzav, where he teaches that the sense conveyed by this statement from Yirmiyahu seems to be negating the message of the Parsha, potentially leaving us perplexed at best and troubled at worst. And here is the text. For when I brought your ancestors out of Egypt and spoke to them, I did not give them commands about burnt offerings and sacrifices, but I gave them this command: obey me and I will be your God, and you will be my people. Walk in obedience to all I command you, that it will go well with you. Yirmiyahu chapter 7, verse 22 to 23. This seems to suggest that the sacrifices may not have been part of God's original intention for the Israelites. It seems to negate the very substance of our Parsha and the focus on Hachana, preparation. What does this mean? The simplest interpretation is that it means I did not only give you commands about the sacrifices and the burnt offerings, but I commanded them that without the proper hachana, without the proper kavanah, They were not the whole of the law, nor were they even the primary purpose, but rather intended to bring all closer. Think about a recipe. Each ingredient itself only can do so much, but when you pull it together and it comes up with something delicious and people enjoy it, it's a whole different experience. Further, Rabbi Shmuel Rabinowitz teaches as follows. Regarding the halachot of sacrifices, thought becomes critical. An incorrect or inexact thought can nullify the sacrifice. And of course, we must ask, why is this so? What is so special about sacrifices that they require such accurate thought? History has taught us the reason for the importance of thought in the work of the temple. Several times, we find the prophets of Israel in the Tanakh warning of the wrong attitudes toward the temple and the services and the sacrifices, an attitude that made the ritual act the more important one and ignored the significance and message that God wanted us to internalize through the mitzvot. A message clearly that many in our community of faith and others would do well to review. This message is oft repeated through our Nevi'im. In other words, when we prepare our special events, our celebrations, our meals, the focus is not on every single detail in terms of the meaning within themselves, but rather the effect on the group that will be brought together and the experience that will be shared. We do not serve each of the ingredients of a special dish separately, but we put them together. We follow recipes, and we work longer to ensure a lovely result, which will add to the enjoyment of the experience. If it's just sitting on the table and not part of the meal, what would have been the point? Many of our classical as well as contemporary commentators have suggested a very specific reason for this entire sequence of instructions that begin with Shemot, chapter 25, and continue throughout Sefer Vayikra. For one example, let us consider this teaching from Haggaon Shir HaShirim 1:4. When they made the golden calf, the clouds of glory departed, and they did not return until they began to make the Mishkan, the tabernacle. Moshe descended Mount Sinai on Yom Kippur. The following day he assembled the people and transmitted the instructions for the tabernacle. That was on the 11th of Tishrei. It is written, and the people brought more materials each morning. That is on the 12th and 13th day. On the 14th of Tishrei, all the skilled craftsmen took the exact quantity of gold from Moshe, and on the 15th they began to work. Then the clouds of glory returned, and that is why we make our tabernacle, our Sukkot, on the 15th of Tishrei. Remember the need of the human being for tangible and visible proof that we have seen previously. This is just a factor of being human. It is indicative of our fragility. It is this fragility that, according to so many, explain the very physical work of preparing a tangible structure for Sukkot, precisely after the difficult and taxing spiritual work of the Aseret Yemei Teshuvah, ending with Yom Kippur. Returning to our text in question and its inclusion in this long section of such instructions, in Midrash Haggadol 40:38, we see how fleeting the confidence that comes with visual and tangible cues is when we do not perceive their presence. We learn. For over the Mishkan a cloud of God rested by day, and a fire would appear by night. When the Israelites saw the pillar of cloud resting on the Mishkan, they rejoiced, and they said, now God has been reconciled with us. But when night came, and the pillar of fire descended and surrounded the Mishkan, everyone saw it as one flame of fire, and began to feel sorrow and weep, saying, woe to us, for nothing we have labored, nothing is left. All our great work has been burnt up in a moment. They rose early the next morning and saw the pillar of cloud encompassing the Mishkan. Immediately they rejoiced with an incredible joy, saying, this is testimony to the world that if they wanted to make such a thing, they could not. Why? Because of God's great love for Israel. That is why it says in Shir HaShirim, chapter 2, verse 3, his shade I desired and sat in it, and the fruit was sweet to my palate. We need something physical. I remember, and I may have shared at some point, my mom, Zichron Shalom, always telling the story of how my cousin was a baby when she herself was young. My cousin was about 2 years old, and she would be playing with a ball, and it would go under the closet, and she would cry, because for her, the ball was gone. My mom, all grown up at about 12, would laugh at the 2-year-old and just go get the ball, thinking that the baby was silly for not being able to do it. But this is the human way. We need proof. It is we who need the Karbanot, just as the 2-year-old child needs to see the ball. It is we who need to recite our Tfilot, just as the 2-year-old needs to know that her toys are near. It is we who need to make preparations for visible and tangible celebrations so that we feel the connection. This is what the Karbanot and all of their preparations are. The Karbanot are for us. Returning to Rabbi Lord Sachs. This was a response to the episode of the golden calf. This, I have argued elsewhere, represented a passionate need on the part of the people to have God close, not distant, in the camp, not at the top of the mountain, accessible to everyone, not just to Moshe, and on a daily basis, not just moments of miracle or events that could not be explained. This is what the tabernacle, its service, and its korbanot represented. It was the home of the Shekhinah, the divine presence, from the same root as Shin, Chaf, Nun, neighbor, Shachen. Every sacrifice in Hebrew, korban, meaning that which is brought near, was an act of coming close to the Shekhinah, presence. So in the tabernacle, God comes close to the people. And in bringing the sacrifices, the korbanot, the people come close to God. This was not, teaches Rabbi Sachs, God's original plan. As is evident from Yirmiyahu here in the covenant ceremony in Shemot, Parakim 19 through 24, the intention was that God would be the people's sovereign and lawmaker. God would be their king, not their neighbor. God would be distant, not close. The people would obey God's laws, know that God was there. They would not bring God sacrifices on a regular basis. God does not need sacrifices. But God responded to the people's wish, much as God did when they said they could not continue to hear God's overwhelming voice at Sinai. I have heard what this people said to you. Everything they have said was good. We learn in Devarim chapter 5, verse 25. What brings people close to God has to do with people, not God. This is why the sacrifices were not God's initial intent, but rather reflected the Israelites' spiritual, psychological need, a need for closeness to the divine at regular and predictable times. In other words, the korbanot were needed as indication of the response of the people, amplifying the earlier point made by Rabbi Sachs that this is all about the proper human response to the miracles of God's protection and God's agency over the B'nai Yisrael. Aviva Zornberg wants us to focus on the proper response, on the intentionality. She cites the text of Shemot Rabbah to illustrate this point. How many days were the people with God? Not even one day. Even as the people stood at Sinai and declared with their mouths, we will do and we will listen, Nasa v'nishma, their hearts were mechuvanim, were turned to idolatry, because that is what they understood. How many times do we do something, pray, but our mind is somewhere else? We're not totally in the zone. Sincerity is always a hard level to reach in our actions. Sincerity is a hard level to reach in our actions. Why do we think it is that so many people in our Jewish collective who during the course of the year may or may not observe this or that will go absolutely attuned and intentional about every single detail of preparation for Pesach? And then when you sit at the Seder, you know that you have to be in the zone. That's the value of preparation, of hachana. We learn in chapter 5 of Devarim, Moshe calls all of Israel together and says to them, Shema Yisrael, et ha-chukim v'et ha-mishpatim asher anochi dober ba'oznechem hayom v'lemantem otam u'shmartem lasotam. Hear, O Israel, the statutes, the chukim, the ordinances, the mishpatim, the laws that we understand, the laws that we may not understand, which I speak into your ear. And God heard the sound of your words when you spoke to me. And God said, I have heard the sound of the words of this people that they have spoken to you. Heitivu kol asher daveru. They have done well in all that they have spoken. Would that be the case? Would they keep the commandments all their days? In other words, we hope for this goal. And as we go through the Torah, the Meshet Chumshei Torah, it's reflective of Moshe's hope and wish that this intentionality and this hachana preparation will be working together symbiotically. It's a process. Remember our 2-year-old whose ball disappeared under the cabinet? That is the same 2-year-old whose favorite words are no and why. We need proof. Yes, we do evolve from being that 2-year-old, but only to a certain extent. We all in our respective stages of development have a point at which we see and think that we know what there is, but it seemingly disappears from our range of vision, hearing, and understanding, and then we are lost. What then? This was the point at which, according to many, that the Egel HaMasecha, that the golden calf, was fashioned. So here we have a very clear set of instructions of what we are to do continually. Continual hachana, continue intentionality, continual efforts to keep God's presence amongst us. We need the structures, not God. Rabbi Yonatan Dalin of the Jewish Theological Seminary uses poetry as his commentary on Parshat Tzav, its visuals, its meanings, the cloud, and all its elements. And here is his writing. I try to bless when I wear your stars as my blanket, my winter coat when days are dark, when life is a knife, resting on the altar of time. I try to bless because my bread is warm and the salt is at my table. It is my reminder, fine grains of labor and endurance. When the smoke fills you, when the fat is burned and the flour is poured, I have to ask, do you bless as well? Your table is set, widows and orphans, your guests. If we could sit together, I am certain, I would only be able to try. In Rabbi Dalin's beautiful poetry, he brings together the idea of the sacrifice, the preparation, what it is to teach us, that we are to bring everybody together, that we are not to be so focused on the actual elements of the experience, but understand that those elements help to make the experience, and then we include everyone in that experience. That is bringing it all together. That is what we need to learn in the way that Karbanot and by substitution our Tfilot today are structured. We as Jews have the gifts of so many detailed celebrations. If we engage ourselves intentionally and participate in the hakana, in the preparation, as well as the celebratory products, we cannot help but be bolstered by the reminder of God's presence, of our own connectedness, and of the meaning of so many symbols and elements. We feel love, spirituality, and connectedness through visual, auditory, aromatic, and other sensory experiences. These are our clouds. This is the meaning of the bread and the salt. This is the Shekhinah dwelling in our Mishkan. Aviva Zornberg reminds us of a wonderful reading brings to our attention a wonderful reading to amplify the universality of this dilemma of seeing in the darkness, which we have talked about also in past weeks, perceiving God at all times and the tangible value of what may seem to be intangible. She brings to our attention William Wordsworth's poem, Ode on Intimations of Immortality, and just a few lines of it. not in entire forgetfulness, not in utter nakedness, but in trailing clouds of glory do we come from God, who is our home. There has passed away a glory from earth. We are given the instructions of the Karbanot. We are given the many laws of Hachana in our own lives for Pesach today, to remind us that we are doing all of these things for elevated purposes. It is we who need them. God doesn't need them. That's why Karbanot, as those things that bring us closer, is a much better understanding of what we're talking about than the idea of sacrificing. It is not a sacrifice to achieve our purpose of coming closer together. It is a fulfillment of all that we do, of all our preparation. May we all continue to strive to find meaning in both the hachana, the preparation, and the maaseh, the deed, the things we do, the events of our celebrations and observances. And may we never feel that the Shekhinah is far from us. Shabbat Shalom, and I wish you all a Chag Pesach Kasher V'Sameach. Lehitraat.